Remember where Castaneda talks about stopping the world? Sometimes Maharajji would do things to you and you'd feel like he'd just stopped the world. Sometimes you'd be listening and sometimes not, and then suddenly Maharajji would do something and you'd hang suspended. There was one period in my life where I used to keep whole scrapbooks all about horses. No one else knew about them. And once, when my mind was somewhere else, Maharajji turned to me and asked me about horses. My mind just stopped. Every time my mind wandered, Maharajji would catch me. He would never miss. When I wavered from the concentration in the least bit, he would catch me and put me back. Maharajji was sitting on the tucket and he leaned over and kissed Kabir on the head. That kiss affected everyone who was there. It made people feel really warm inside. Every time Maharajji would hug somebody, everyone in the room would go, ah. Darshan of love. All the love and affection and kindness that came from Maharajji, you cannot get these from man. How can you describe what it was to be with Maharajji? It is like trying to describe the sweetness of a fruit or the fragrance of a rose. You never have met one so lovable, so kind, so sweet. How could you not love him? You almost wanted to give up your breath to him if you could. A devotee asked me if I had ever been caught by Maharajji's glance in a way that, as he briefly looked at me, I forgot everything but knew only Maharajji's love. The devotee said it is a wonderful and rare thing when he looks at you in that way, and you are very fortunate if you can hold his gaze in that state. He could go through your heart with just a look or a movement. The slightest thing could feel as if it were piercing you. I was leaving for Nepal the next day. It was evening and we were sitting in the back of the ashram. Maharajji never actually mentioned my leaving the next day because I had received a Quit India notice. But at the end of the darshan, he just held my eyes with his. It was the Guru's glance, a look of absolute, universal, total compassion. It was love beyond words. Not long, but just my being in his being. And that filled me with such, what's the word for that feeling? Grief or longing, or I felt in that look infinite compassion. And even though the glance didn't last very long, its power still comes through to me, particularly at very difficult times. I was only about 16 when I first met Maharajji. It was a Bhandara feast and many people were there. When I met him, I was filled with such bhava, transported, it seemed, by divine love. Maharajji instructed me to serve the devotees at the Bhandara. There were many to be fed and we worked long hours, but that feeling never left me. When asked what he experienced on meeting Maharajji, one man replied, "It is not something that can be said, it must be experienced. The love, the affection, the compassion, the grace of knowing him." at darshans. He would talk with no limit and with no rhyme or reason. If he was abusing someone, he would go on shouting with no end. But he was hearing everything. What an intoxication! He would behave like a very abnormal man, doing all sorts of nonsense, shouting and abusing. But what made you stay there? You wouldn't be conscious of time and space. You never questioned where you were or why you were there. Days and months would pass with him, and they seemed like a moment. Sometimes I wasn't aware that I had not eaten or slept for days, and he made me do things I wouldn't do in the normal course. If I wanted to leave him, he'd make me stay. If I wanted to stay another night, he'd force me to go. He was always rattling on like a child, talking about this and that, most of which wasn't translated. It was like seeing a fine foreign movie where you don't really need the subtitles. In some instances, he would say a thing only once. If you didn't catch it, it was gone. One Westerner was sitting in front of the Hanuman Murti in Vrindavan. She was very much longing to see Maharajji, but in those days he was refusing to allow Westerners in for darshan. She sat there, head bowed, singing some kirtan. Just then there was some flurry of excitement. She looked up, and there, standing directly in front of her, smiling so very sweetly, was Maharajji. Then, to her delight, he cocked his head and said in English, "Too much." Several Westerners were recalling Maharajji's hit parade of English phrases. A few were coconut, right face, quick, march, left, right, go, sit down, bus has come, sometimes, damn fool, commander in chief, thank you, stand up, water. When you were with Maharajji, you talked about what he wanted to talk about. If you started your topic, Maharaj chiding and playfulness at darshans. One of Maharajji's devotees was 80 years old and very spry, like a mountain goat. One day he came in for Maharajji's darshan when a young, distant relative of his was also there. The relative pranamed to the old devotee but didn't get up. Maharajji turned to the elder and said, "If you had money, he'd get up and touch your feet." Once a devotee wore a new and expensive sari to darshan. Maharajji said, "You know, Ma, I went to this wealthy family for a visit, but they wore such simple clothes that you couldn't tell the difference between the rich ones and the poor ones. So simple and clean." One evening Maharajji was out squatting on a dirty street when along came some important people, poets, judges, and officials. As they stood around Maharajji, he asked them, "Why don't you sit?" With some hesitation they sat down on the street. Immediately Maharajji arose. "Okay, let's go." I had purchased some apples in Mathura to take as prasad for Maharajji. They were costly, and I had handpicked them. When I offered them, Maharajji said, "Put them away, I'll eat them later." I wouldn't do it because of my pride. So I peeled the first, and it was rotten. And so with the second, and third, and fourth. Maharajji looked at me and said, "I told you to put them away." I discovered later that the other 5 were fine. I was working in Agra, and whenever Maharajji came to Vrindavan, I would take him 10 or 15 rupees worth of prasad. I would see others coming with so much more than that. One Sunday, I felt quite bad because I could only bring so little. Monday morning, I was waiting to touch his feet before going off to work, and I thought to myself, with my limits, my 10 rupees are worth 10,000 of someone else's. Just then Maharajji came out of his room saying, "Strange people come to me and offer 10 rupees and say they have offered 10,000." There was one expression he would never allow me to catch with my camera. He'd be sitting normally, and then all of a sudden he would straighten up and look directly down at you, his eyes wide open and intense. I tried for months to catch that expression. I'd take a photograph, but in the time it took to advance the reel, he'd return to normal, giggling and laughing. He'd look at me and smile with delight at my frustration. Once he walked over to me and took my bamboo staff and began to do this Chaplinesque dance with it. He moved it back and forth as if he had never seen a stick before, as if he were a large monkey. He started playing with it and moving it around. Then he just threw it away and walked down the road. That was the end of that darshan. I was the only one who saw this happen. One morning, the coals in the brazier in front of Maharajji had gotten really low. So they piled some wood on it, and of course, the wood started to smoke and wouldn't light. So Maharajji said they should pour some kerosene on it, which they did, but still it didn't light. Big clouds of smoke were coming up. Maharajji was leaning forward, looking, and then all of a sudden, pow! The flames leaped right up to the roof. Maharajji jumped back, as delighted as a child, giggling and clapping his hands. He was so thrilled. One day I got to the ashram very early, and I was just sitting over on the porch when some man arrived carrying a gun. Of course, Maharajji said, "Bring it over. Let me see that rifle." So the man opened up the barrel and checked the chamber to make sure it wasn't loaded. Even though it was a shotgun, broken in the middle, he wanted to make sure it wasn't loaded. Maharajji took it and opened it up, and then he snapped it shut and held it up to his shoulder as you would to shoot it. He played a while, opening it up and snapping it shut, then gave it back to the man and sent him away. After the man had left, he asked, "Why does he carry a gun?" I said, "I don't know," my standard answer. And Maharajji said, "He carries it because he's afraid of things." Purity of darshans. In the winter of 1971, it started getting very crowded, and Maharajji began telling people to go to different places. I was told to go to Puri. He also said I could go and see Goenka on the way back. I had been feeling that I really needed to learn something about meditation. So I went to Bodh Gaya and stayed there for 40 days. During that time, my mind was exceedingly clear, like nothing I'd ever experienced before. When I came back to Dada's house, Maharajji was there. I don't know if I was experiencing my love for him in a new way or if my heart was closed, maybe both. But all I was seeing was a man doing all these different things, and I felt none of that love connection I had felt before. There was a clearness and an openness, but none of that emotionality and warmth. I stayed there 2 or 3 days and kept waiting for the return of that feeling I'd felt before. And I saw all these people opening in a way that I missed. I prayed to Maharajji and it still didn't change. I decided I'd go to the Sangam. While I was there, I prayed that after bathing, my heart would open again. And as I was bathing, I felt my heart open wide. I got out, and everywhere I looked, everything was glowing. I got into a rickshaw to go back to Dada's house, and I realized that I had no prasad. And the route from the Sangam to Dada's doesn't go by any bazaar. We did pass a calendar wala with those devotional calendar pictures. I looked at all the pictures, but they were so gosh. Just as I was giving up, I looked down at my feet, and there on the ground in the dust was a picture of Ram embracing Hanuman, which was so exquisite. I bought the picture and went on to Dada's house. I was late, so I didn't think there would be time for me to reach Maharajji and present the prasad. But as I came through the door, a path opened up right to Maharajji. I was so opened up from the meditation course and the Sangam that I gave the prasad without my ego. It was the purest act I had ever done around Maharajji. Something was taking place, but I was not doing it. I put the picture on the tucket and sat down. Maharajji picked it up and looked at it. Tears started coming out of his eyes, and I started to cry too. Then he stood up and stormed out of the room, giving the picture to Dada. A few weeks later, this picture was put up in the Vrindavan temple right next to the Murti. The point of the story is that because I was able to do that selflessly, he was able to accept it fully. At other times, I came with all kinds of prasad, and I would really want him to accept it in a certain way, and he would hardly look at it. I'd polish up the apples for hours, holding them on the bus, say mantras over them. I was trying to be pure. But this time, I wasn't trying to be pure. The purity was simply there.
Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram.
Touching his feet. I take the dust from the lotus feet of the Guru to cleanse the mirror of my mind. So begins a sacred ode to Hanuman. Touching, holding, rubbing the Guru's feet has always had profound significance in the Hindu tradition. For out of the Guru's feet comes the spiritual elixir, the soma, the nectar, the essence of the sacred Ganges river, the subtle pran or energy that heals and awakens. To touch the feet of such a being is not only to receive this grace, but it is an act of submission, of surrender to God, for that is what the Guru represents on earth. But for those of us around Maharajji, the theories connected with the spiritual value of touching the Guru's feet had little, if anything, to do with the matter. Rather, it was the strangest pull of the heart. A mother who with her husband had come to India from the United States out of concern for the well-being of her son, who was deeply devoted to Maharajji, stayed on for some time. At the conclusion of her visit, she reports the following. Then as the time came that we had to return to the States, I began thinking about the last darshan I would have. I realized that I really wanted to touch Maharajji's feet. I didn't know why I wanted to, but I did. I figured that if I went ahead and did it, it would upset my husband. But I thought, so it upsets him, it is still my decision. At my last darshan, I touched Maharajji's feet. To my surprise, so did my husband. How vividly I recall, after my first meeting with Maharajji, how all my disdain and arrogance disappeared before an almost overwhelming desire, literally, to be at his feet. It was perhaps the second or third visit with Maharajji when the opportunity presented itself. I was watching the man next to me. The expression on his face suggested that he was experiencing waves of rapture, and as I watched him out of the corner of my eye, I felt jealous. We sat next to each other, cross legged, before a large, heavy chest, high wooden table. The man, the principal of a school in the vicinity, was probably in his late 50s. He was dressed in a heavy woolen suit with socks. His shoes had been left outside the door of the temple. A tie, a muffler, and, in the fashion common to the men of the hill country in this late November, a woolen hat. Before us, sitting on the table, cross legged, was Maharajji, well wrapped in a bright plaid blanket, so that only his head showed above the blanket, and a bare foot stuck out beneath. It was this foot that was the source of both the rapture and the jealousy, for the man was massaging the foot with great tenderness and love, and I was yearning to be in his place. How bizarre to find myself sitting in a tiny Hindu temple halfway around the world, jealous because I could not rub an old man's foot. As I reflected on this strange turn of events, Maharajji talked now to one and now to another of the 20 or so people gathered in the small room at the back of the temple compound. He spoke in Hindi, which I did not understand, but he seemed to be asking one a question, scolding another, joking with a third, and giving instructions to a fourth. In the midst of these conversations, I saw him move ever so slightly, and his other foot appeared beneath the blanket just beside me. I suspected that only people who had been around him for some time were allowed to massage his feet, and I was the newest comer. But I decided I couldn't be faulted for trying. So slowly my hands went up and touched the foot and began to massage. But instead of waves of bliss, my mind was full of the sharp edges of doubt and confusion as to whether I should use my fingers or my palms. Just as suddenly as the foot appeared, it was withdrawn back under the blanket. My mind was filled with self recrimination about my own impurity. As the visit went on, Maharajji took me more and more out of my self consciousness and into a space that had no familiar boundaries. I was experiencing waves of confusion bordering on hysteria, and that was the moment the foot reappeared before me, and again I reached for it. But this time my mind was too overwhelmed to analyze procedure. I just clung to the foot as a drowning man to a life preserver. There was one particular moment I remember in Kainchi. I was sitting in front of Maharajji's tucket, rubbing his feet for the longest time, wondering if I was pure enough to be doing this. Then I went beyond thoughts, going deeper and deeper into that love until there wasn't any concern about rubbing Maharajji's feet or even my love for Maharajji. It was just swimming in his feet. Sita would always sit on my right, and being a greedy, obnoxious Leo, I'd push my way up front and grab Maharajji's foot. Sita would always want the same foot, so I'd have a shoving match with her. She'd say, "Get away from here, you don't belong here," and she'd throw her shoulder down to block me. Sometimes Maharajji would give his foot to me, and sometimes to her. I, I very rarely touched his feet because I felt he was too pure. What was it about the darshans that captured us? Was it the many levels and changes, or the moments of timelessness, or perhaps the intimacy and love? Or was it the talking and chiding and humor and maybe the purity? Then, of course, perhaps it was the touching of the feet. Or was it all of them? Or none of them? Was the connection perhaps a subjective one beyond our dualistic experiencing? Maharajji, who are you? Are you other than our very selves? There is no answer. There is no question really. There is just darshan with his grace.
Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Ram